So I had a cool thought and I wanted to share it with people. So here I am. I do sound a little bit better. My voice is not quite as bad, at least doesn't hurt as much to talk nearly at all. But I'm not going to focus on that, and I'll probably make another video regarding this sort of topic in the future. Love people coming on. Love Lock War, cool. Wendeezy 420, cool. So this concept is very advanced from a plant physiology standpoint. Or rather, what I'm trying to say is the concept I came up with is a euphemism or a metaphor for plant physiology in this way. So, that's great. Environmental biology 1A. Fifth period's about to start. The bell just rung. So okay. I thought this would be an interesting metaphor with regards to human, I guess it's sort of a thing that we all kind of experience if we're on the internet anyways, and that's advertisement. So any kind of advertisement really, and the logic and you could say the inner mechanics and outer mechanics of how advertising works, how marketing works, and manipulation in general. And when I say manipulation, I know that 9 times out of 10 people think of that word as a pejorative, and it usually is. But truly, in the very pure way that manipulation, whether it's manipulating an object to do something you want, or manipulating a person or a situation or something, I just mean kind of like the word manipulation without all of the context necessarily that it typically is steeped in. So with advertisements, so most people don't want to watch advertisements. You have to make people want to watch them, or you have to somehow make them consumed. And in fact, the usage and the common usage of the word consume, like to consume media, like you would consume food, or to consume, advertisements and advertising in the same fashion, it's actually going to make this metaphor a little bit easier. So your consumption of media typically or commonly is predicated on the additional consumption of advertisement in the form of an ad in a commercial, or an ad in a newspaper or a written medium. That's kind of obvious. Those sorts of advertisements are rather obvious, right? But they're not necessarily, they're somewhat easy to avoid, or at least people feel that they're somewhat easy to avoid because they're so obvious. Like product placement, for example, is a little bit less obvious, but it's there. It's just not necessarily always so in your face, although it can be. And my whole point, let me just put the premise out here. The point that I'm trying to make is that advertisement and the way in which advertisements, I suppose, are sort of sent to us or sort of exposed to us is very similar to how pathogens are exposed to or end up being consumed by their host. And I know that for those people out there who are marketers or work in marketing in some way, I'm not trying to say that you're all parasites. I'm just trying to say that a lot of the strategy is sort of similar. And in fact, you might take this as a beneficial thing to hear this point, which is that by some regards, parasitism in general is the most common method of life in the animal kingdom, at least. Not very surprising when you consider all the different organisms in the animal kingdom, and when you consider the fact that, a lot of them are insects, So, all the different small species of insects, this is considered to be the case. So, advertising and the strategies behind advertising are very similar to the strategies that parasites use to infect a host. And in fact, a lot of the fundamentals of parasitism kind of match up too. Not all, and I'm going to be skipping and simplifying a little bit. But essentially, if you're a good parasite, rather, if you're a parasite that wants to be really successful for the longest period of time, which you don't have to be, you don't want your host to die. Probably. You probably don't want to accidentally destroy your host in the same way that humans don't necessarily want to destroy the earth, even though it's got a lot of exploitable resources, both renewable and non-renewable, depending on how you exploit them anyways, and gather them. So you don't want to do that. A really successful parasite doesn't want to have that situation. So for example, when people believe that pathogens and fungi and organisms that are going to, infect their crop or whatever, it's not this nefarious plot. They probably would do better if they didn't outright kill their host in the cases where they do. In the cases where they don't, however, they just often simply reduce the parts of them that make them able to fight them off, usually things like effectors, what are called effectors. And that's kind of what I mean. So you can use this sort of paradigm to explain really complex, highbrow aspects of plant physiology and other kinds of physiology and biology and ecology for that matter. So, for example, I mentioned effectors. Pathogens have, a lot of pathogens, most pathogens, pretty much all pathogens have what are called effectors, or they use things called effectors. And what effectors do is they affect things. Typically, one of the more common things that effectors can do is they can affect the defense, the immune system of their host. In the case of plants have what's called an innate immune system, or what I like to call immune system 1.0. Animals and mammals and humans, for example, have an adaptive immune system and an innate immune system. So we have immune system 1.0 and 2.0. And the difference between them is pretty simple. Well, it's not too simple, but one of the big differences is that we've got little microbes living in our body that are specifically meant to kill pathogens, like white blood cells and things like that exist among the other functioning cells and organisms. And we have aspects of our immune system that will adapt to the detection of new antibodies, the detection of new aspects of the pathogen in order to be more successful in the future. Plants don't have that. Plants do not have that at all. They have things that are kind of like that, sort of similar to that in some cases, but they do not have that. But they have a mercenary army instead. Instead of having their own standing army of white blood cells and neutrophils and memory B cells and all these sorts of things, they've sort of subcontracted that out to other microbes like endophytes that will enter into the organism and colonize them. I just made a post about that today, 30 minutes ago, where Fusarium solani K strain, which normally Fusarium solani is a very, very noxious, very, very terrible pathogen to get. Hello, Mustafa. Glad to see you online. So, okay, extractions, hello. So, you have this sort of, this pathogen, this typically what we would consider a very, very terrible pathogen, but this particular strain doesn't have that pathogenicity that you are used to when you hear the words Fusarium. And in fact, it was able to act as a beneficial microbe and an endophyte. It colonized these tomato plants at the root and didn't go up into the stem. but it caused effects in the plant physiology that did affect the leaves and the stem. And those effects were the upregulation of certain genes, and those genes are going to have a detrimental effect on, in this case, in the study for the post, Tetranychus urticae, or the two-spotted spider mite. So, in that way, instead of having like a natural sort of white blood cell-like entity in their bodies, they had another organism that's external to them join into their body and have this effect. Now, again, it's not like there's this like, I don't know, I don't want to like turn this into a debate or anything, but like for the sake of this, I'm not going to say that there's some sort of like intellectual, there's not like an intellect behind this. It's more like an instinctual thing. It's more like I don't know, it's not like there's this big thing going on. I'm not going to talk about that necessarily, but going back to the advertising metaphor, if you're making an advertisement, you want people to pay attention to it and you want people to engage in it. And the really, really popular advertisements are viral, right? So the terminology just really lends itself to this sort of metaphor. So viral advertising is advertising that is so effective that people will pass it on to other people horizontally, which again, horizontal gene transfer or horizontal transfer of a pathogen to other hosts is a thing. And I just think it's really like delicious that like that these terms work so well with each other for this metaphor. It really makes you think. So you can transmit this meme, this like social concept to other people virally. This sort of viral advertising engagement is so effective. And it's the very same for pathogens. Pathogens that are incredibly effective spread. You can't be effective without that, essentially. Without being really good at infecting and without being really good at spreading. So another thing to keep in mind is that pathogens that are generalists, pathogens that have a very high, very, very wide range, typically have basically myriad ways of affecting the plant immune system. And not just one single species, because there's multiple species involved, sometimes hundreds or thousands of species at one time. You run into this problem, or lack of problem for the pathogen, that it is able to essentially dismiss or otherwise mitigate the defense responses of so many organisms, so many hosts, essentially. So why is that important? Well, that's important because if you're trying to breed like a resistant plant, you have to understand that this organism might have multiple ways of making sure it infects the plant. It's also going to have multiple ways of infecting other plants, and in that way it's going to be closer than other pathogens might be in a given geographic range, because it's more likely with more hosts that it's somewhere among the area. There's always going to be sort of exceptions to this, but like for example with Botrytis cinerea, you've got a pathogen that can infect many, many, many different and very, very different and diverse species. They're not all the same kind of species or from the same genus or family. So different families of plants are going to be somewhat radically different in the way that they interact with pathogens. And if this pathogen can interact with all of them and effectively infect them, then you're dealing with something that's very good at what it does. It's very viral, even though it's a fungus. But you know what I'm trying to say. So going back to the metaphor. So you've got like things like effectors. So you've got ways that you want to make that pathogen, or virulence traits would probably be a better way to talk about this. You've got things called you've got virulence, which is a quality of a pathogen, its ability to infect, whether it's a plant pathogen or an animal pathogen or whatever. And traits that increase or decrease virulence are those traits. They're genetic. They're genetic traits that perhaps create a protein that lets it, or an enzyme that lets it dissolve part of the plant's like outer layer or multiple layers, which is the case with powdery mildew and botrytis, for example. For example, powdery mildew is able to use cutinase, pectinase, and what's the last one? Cutinase, pectinase, and I'm going to have a political moment here. What are the 3 branches of government? Rick Perry. Well, there's cutin, which is the waxy layer. There's pectin, which is the more internal. Oh, cellulose, of course. So cellulase. So cellulose, pectin, and cutin, which is the reverse order of how they are structured on the plant. So an organism that can physically dissolve these barriers is going to be way more effective than one that requires it to be taken up or requires it to have a vector that maybe damages the plant first and then vectors the organism. So if it can just literally be a spore and latch onto the plant and glue itself and then get into the plant that way by just dissolving the outer layer, it has its own way of getting in. An organism that doesn't have that option is going to be a little bit less virulent, although it might have other advantages, like maybe it can survive in the water longer, or maybe it's just more stable and can just sit in the soil for longer and, statistically speaking, more likely to interact with its host. Lovelock War says, are you saying when dealing with certain pathogens affects the plant's defense systems is compromised and other issues will show like lies or powdery I don't really understand that sentence. If you can rewrite that sentence, I will answer it. I'm not even sure. Pathogens affects the plant's defense. Well, so if a plant's immune system is compromised in some way, like there's another infection already happening, or it's already been quite stressed from the environment, then the pathogen will probably have an easier time infecting the organism. But that's not always the case, because depending on how the stressors affect the immune system and the plant in general, it might be harder because it's creating other defenses that may have an overlap serendipitously with the pathogen, such that the same solution for a plant to save itself during drought, for example, like wilting, for example, maybe makes the pathogen a lot less likely to infect because it was requiring that turgidity in the cells. That lack of water sort of makes it harder for it to infect. Maybe it requires that pressure in order to engage a penetration peg or something like that, like with regards to powdery mildew. Okay, cool. I'm glad that I got that. But at the same time, if you have a pathogen or if you have a stressor that doesn't overlap or essentially doesn't mitigate the virulence factors or traits of a pathogen, then the opposite can happen. It'll be more susceptible. And that's the thing I think about stress that people really often don't realize or overlook or just are not really educated about, because they hear the word stress, they think about their own stresses, and then they go, oh, well, it's never okay to stress a plant. But in fact, a lot of times it's incredibly okay to stress a plant because, one, it might not reduce, but it might create the sort of produce that you want in general. So there's no reason not to, and it's a very bad idea not to stress your plant in that case. For example, vintners in viticulture drought stress their plants all the time. And that's because it changes the sugar to acid content in the resulting fruit, the grapes. And in that way, it's incorrect as a cultivation procedure to not create the produce that you want, to create the wine that you want at the end. So in the same way, like with other plants, like with cannabis or peppers or something, you might stress the plant out in a particular way. Maybe you don't pretend that like cutting off parts of the plant doesn't stress it. It stresses it. It's just something that we're used to doing, and it's a type of stress that we have sort of not thought about a lot. I don't want to talk for everyone when I say we, but it is a form of stress. It is a form of stress. It's very minor, but it is a thing. It's definitely a thing. Like cutting off the meristem so that the plant like creates multiple reproductive structures. That's a form of stressing a plant out, but people do that all the time, and it's acceptable. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. It's just that like the truth of the matter is that you are stressing the plant out, and that stress is a lot more of a complex thing than perhaps people realized. Cannabis Garden says, newt-locked plants always seem to become super frosty. In some past experience, not always. Interesting thing. Yeah, so like that's sort of like, I like that anecdote, because things change and different cultivars might respond differently, or the fact that you have a cacophony of different things going on at any one time with cultivation, like you can't just like assume like that all of your environmental conditions are going to be the same, all of your cultivation considerations are going to be the same, all of your pest pressures are going to be the same, when like year to year they're not. And so like you might change one variable consciously, and you might change 100 different variables unconsciously. And like that's why laboratory assessments are important, because somebody can just say, oh, well, I added this and I stopped doing this and everything changed, so that must be the reason why X is the case, and it might not be. It could be that plus a few other things that you didn't even realize. So J. Paul, 1989 says, anything specific to do after deleafing cannabis, not defeating it, to limit stress susceptibility to pathogens? And Cannabis answers that kelp and silica are nice for stress. Also super thrive. So, yeah, I mean, like, there's tons of things, whether you're deleafing or not deleafing. But understand that when you're cutting off plant parts, you're going to expose them to the elements. You're going to expose a wound. You're literally cutting into the cuticle, into the entire, well, not just the cuticle, but into the entire plant proper. So you end up with this sort of problem where if there is a pathogen out in the ether that's like going to come in on an airwave that's going to come in on the wind currents or whatever, or on somebody's clothing or their hands, then they might touch briefly that part of the plant, and there you go. You put a bacteria, a colony of bacteria straight into that wound, or you put a spore straight onto that wound. Now, if the pathogen like actually doesn't do very good, if it's just in the wound, then it might not matter. But a lot of pathogens are not like that. Lovelock War is talking about systemic acquired resistance. Speak more on that, please. So SAR, systemic acquired resistance. That's kind of related to what I'm talking about. I guess to talk about in the context of the like advertising metaphor that I had laid out earlier that I haven't gotten back to. SAR is kind of like, I guess it's like what happens to you when you are on the internet for a while, like me, and you've been on the internet and you know how like it works, and like the little details about how advertisers try to like get you to do something, like you click on a video and a pop-up comes up, and 9 times out of 10 you just close it. But maybe you can't close it easily, so you have to like do other stuff, or It's going onto YouTube, expecting to have an ad, and knowing exactly where to position your mouse to skip it or skip it after the appropriate time. Systemic acquired resistance is like that, but for plants. It's when a plant is exposed to certain qualities, and the plant creates the defense compounds, which are very energy intensive. So typically, a lot of plants have passive, like, sort of chemicals and compounds and things that are going on that maybe limit pathogen and pest activity on the plant. But then also, after exposure and detection of those pathogens and pests, they ramp up, and they create these compounds and volatiles and things like that in order to, like, for example, call in other organisms, or to essentially disrupt the pest's ability to, like, digest the food that it's eating. There's all kinds of things like this. Cannibalist says, is this why plants seem to understand and predict lights turning off, dropping just before nightfall? And J. Paul says, I swear YouTube plays longer ads when my phone is moving fast. Yeah, like, I've thought about that. Those things are, it makes you think, right? Like, you wonder if, like, they're geolocating you, and, like, that data causes them to create a more effective, they know they gotcha, so they're going to give you a longer ad. Like that, I wouldn't put that outside the realm of possibility. It might actually be a thing. I don't know, personally. But to answer Cannibalist's question, yeah, kind of. Although it's not necessarily due to, like, pathogens and stuff. It's more like due to the regularity that they're used to. Like, for example, plants that are, they're phototropic, or they're phototrophic. So the ability to detect light and the ability to predict the detection of light is important, for the same reason why it's important to be able to smell food or something that might be, like, important so that you don't get killed, like a poison. Like, that's why we're sensitive to certain chemicals and that sort of a thing, because being sensitive to those chemicals kept you from dying. In the same way, being sensitive to light and the regularity of light and the fact that plants have lived on this earth at different latitudes gives them different sensitivities to how often light is around during the different seasons, right? Hopefully that's not too patronizing, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. I know that you know how to grow plants. So, right, so that's the thing. Pathogens are a lot like advertising in that they rely on certain strategies to sort of overmatch the host's ability to resist them, to tolerate them, to not even, like, be exposed to them in the first place. Lovelock War asks, why sometimes I can see the response when I try to trigger the SAR, the systemic acquired resistance, and other times it seems not to respond. I don't know. Who knows? Like, there could be a ton of reasons. It's hard to really comment on it without a whole lot of context. But it could be that the plant is stressed in other ways. It could be going through, like, nutrient lockout. It could be, because the development of these compounds is very energy intensive. Just like, for example, the production of nectar, or the reproductive processes in general are very energy intensive. So it could be that the plant is just kind of, like, drained, for lack of a better term, and it might take a little bit of time for the plant to kind of recuperate. If the plant's really old, that could be a factor as well. It's harder for older plants to kind of, like, keep that up for longer periods of time. There's, like, just a lack of overall virility, essentially. That's possible as well. So there's all kinds of reasons. It's really not possible to, like, comment other than giving generalizations like that, but that's a good question. And that's actually a really good point, too. People in general, whether they're using a new pesticidal product, or they're using a beneficial organism, or they're trying to, enact a SAR, a systemic acquired resistance response. Sometimes the effect's going to be kind of invisible. The effect is going to be sort of subtle, and there's no obvious way for us to visually identify it always, except to say, well, no pests, so hopefully it's happening. There's no way to confirm the negative that way. But so then to assess it in more detail is kind of difficult. There's a lot of variables. And like cold water concoction says, even an old clone, right? So like an old mother plant or an old clone in the case of cannabis, or really any kind of plant that you're propagating over and over and over again, you run into that problem, which is why it's not desirable to have an old plant for that reason, or an old person for that reason. Although that's a little bit, that's kind of life, but you do run into that issue. Cannabis Garden says, here's something we've chatted about before. The idea that powdery mildew could be systemic. It's not. I have seen plants that have been sprayed over and over and over with Eagle 20, which is myclophenol, and lo and behold, powdery mildew arises. I understand you need spores for PM, but what I've seen defies this. Well, just because, okay, so the first 120 hours of infection with a lot of powdery mildew species is essentially invisible. So, it's kind of hard. You can get a plant that's totally not infected by, visually, you can inspect a plant and not see the masses of conidia that a colony of powdery mildew will create, kind of like a rash, right? You can have that, you can not have that and still have spores on your plant, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. And once you see it, you've already got it. You've already got the the infection is already spread quite a bit. Not systemically, of course, but epiphytically on the surface. With regards to people spraying Eagle 20 over and over again, I don't know, again, who knows? Could the person have been spraying it ineffectively? Could the product have been old? Could the powdery mildew be resistant possibly? I don't know. But it's definitely not infectiously systemic. Although I had a really good conversation with Kyle MGC over there on his account. I love his stuff. I love his content. I love all that intellectual sort of educational stuff with phytopathology. Really cool stuff. And we were having a small conversation about this topic in particular, where people were sending me to that page or a particular post or something because I had the temerity to say that powdery mildew is not systemic, and you can ask any sort of phytopathologist, they're going to say the same thing. And the American Phytopathology Society says the exact same thing. But what they were finding and what people were confusing for systemically infectious material was kind of what are essentially antibodies or effectors, or little small residual compounds and organic pieces that were found in, I think, the phloem. I don't want to mischaracterize the situation, and I don't remember the post exactly. But essentially I asked the question, well, okay, the American Phytopathology Society and other societies like it, vehemently disagree with the idea that powdery mildew is systemic, so what's going on? And essentially the person said that the material that they detected was not systemic infectious material, but residual stuff that could essentially tell them that powdery mildew was on the plant. But it wasn't that the pathogen was infecting systemically, like it wasn't traveling through the phloem and xylem channels, which first of all, unlike the human circulatory system, doesn't like go in a like, there's two different channels, and one of them goes one direction only, and one of them goes both directions. So, that's really important to consider. But cold water concoctions is saying, so it is not systemic. Everyone was saying it is systemic recently. For me, I have found it's all environmental. I've had plants show it, and so we sprayed with oils and raised temp and lowered relative humidity. Yeah, it's not systemic. Yep. And it didn't come back the rest of the plants, or for the rest of the plants' lives for 7+ weeks. Well, that's great. I mean, I'm assuming that when you say it's all environmental, I assume you mean the control is all environmental. Obviously, like, like the spores don't just come out of nowhere. There's a pathogen, there's an infection elsewhere that produces spores, sexual or asexual spores, either way, and then they waft on the air and they get everywhere. And for the more generalist powdery mildew species, they get to have a whole bunch more hosts, but for the ones that are more specialized, not so much. Which, by the way, since I'm assuming this question will come up because I've said those words, the pathogens that infect cannabis, or the powdery mildew that infects cannabis, the species, plural, are generalists. And I have a video on that on my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, which is where this video is going to go. I really enjoyed the discussion in this one, so I'm really going to make an effort to make sure that this one gets up. Most of them have been going up anyways. So yeah, it's not systemic, but environmental controls are very important for the mitigation of infection. Once infection is started with powdery mildew, though, the changing of relative humidity, at least for one species, which is Golovinomyces sicoriaceum. I got good at saying that name because I said it so much in the video. But anyways, that organism, when you change the relative humidity and everything, once the spore has already created an aprosorium and a penetration peg, you're not really going to change anything for that particular infection. However, you may mitigate these spores that come afterwards, and when they hit the other plants or the same plant and they reinfest the same host, that might change the dynamics of their infection. Because in the same way that plants rely on the sun and the different changes in the season to let them know, oh, it's time for me to create flowers, it's time for me to create reproductive structures, to get pollinated, and then produce fruit and seeds and all that at the right time before I die. The pathogen, or the spores, also are very sensitive to humidity spikes, or at least powdery mildew is, and botrytis too, because that's very important for their viability. So essentially, through their evolutionary development, being not sensitive to relative humidity was bad, and being sensitive to the relative humidity changes was good. So that was conserved, and that's why we see it now. But very good question, very good statement. Appreciate the input for sure. But yeah, so I mean, so pathogens, so parasites in general are a lot like advertisements, and they manipulate you to try to pass them on to others, either horizontally through, being like, this is cool, I'm going to send this video to my friend, or I'm going to send this video to somebody else, because maybe what they do is they confirm something that you like, and so you want to share that with somebody, or you find it interesting, or you find it stimulating, or you find it attractive. All of those reasons, any of them, are reasons that the advertisement will go on to be passed to another host, who will then either like it or not like it, or maybe they don't even click the link. In plant pathology terms or context, that's kind of the same as like a spore going around and then landing not on a host, but on a wooden panel. So spores are very energy unintensive to create. That's why they were developed before seeds. In plants, obviously. So like you got ferns and things, and they make spores. They don't make seeds. So like then seeds develop afterwards because they have advantages to spores don't have, and disadvantages too. That's why you still see spores and fungi and other organisms as well, because they do serve a purpose and they do work in some scenarios better than others. But I was going to go somewhere with that. So there's horizontal transfer of a pathogen, but there's also vertical transfer. Vertical transfer is when the parent basically sends the pathogen or passes the pathogen along to their progeny directly, or indirectly, I suppose. So in a similar fashion, you could look at like values and tradition and history and all of those like cultural things that people like to pass down to their children, or at least younger people. It's the same kind of thing, right? Because you are essentially, whether it's genes or memes, you're passing things down to other people at your level, or people above your level or below your level. And pathogens are doing the same thing. They want to be passed to your peers, to your hosts, your conspecifics, and also to the people that are going to be the next generation. If you're a parasite, that's great. That's the best thing you could hope for, because that guarantees you a host. No searching, no luck, none of that. You are immediately, you're immediately acquiring another host, right like that, with no work needed except from your parent. And you don't have to worry about any of that, any of those problems of vectoring or none of that stuff. Now, I should also talk about how, hey, Canape Incorporated, is that how you, Canape, how do you pronounce that? Give me like a pronunciation guide for your name, but hello to you. But like, okay, so values, memes, concepts are also passed, just like genes and genetic information are passed, and pathogens are passed in that way too. So, I should say that it's important to note that what was once parasitic can become mutualistic and even symbiotic if there's enough of a relationship, and that relationship spans a long enough period of time and enough changes occur between the relationship of the host and the parasite. Canopy. Oh, I would not have gotten that. That would not have been my first or even my third choice of pronouncing that. I like that. Canopy Incorporated. Cool. Yeah, if you had another N, that would have made more sense linguistically. But I'm glad that you spelled that out for me. So, anyways, right. So in the same way, I was paused, so I'm just going to repeat what I just said. So in the same way, a pathogen that becomes a symbiont or becomes some sort of a beneficial organism for the host is the same way that like a product or an advertisement might posit some real value to the host. It might actually be valuable, but it's also an advertisement. And what I mean by that is that, it might actually be, it's just because somebody's advertising something doesn't mean that it's like intrinsically bad, right? Like there are ways that you want to advertise a thing, any kind of thing. Like, for example, like the late night advertisements, like if you or someone has had mesothelioma, like that's a PSA, right? That's still an advertisement, right? So, you want to, so sometimes things that like are passed down that are originally deleterious can actually become helpful and indeed beneficial. In an advertising sort of commercial analogy, I suppose you could say that that's like a business that starts out small has to advertise, has to get the information out. Somebody like me who's just got, a personal entrepreneur, and is like, you have to brand yourself. You have to make people aware of what you're doing. You have to go and give presentations and make videos, always be making content like I'm doing right now, and interacting with people who are like-minded like all of you. You got to do a lot of that. And then over time, if your values are uncorrupted mostly, and you're trying to do a net benefit for, trying to achieve a net benefit for the world, then, all of that advertising evolved me, or evolved anyone who's in that sort of mindset, to essentially benefit society. And so there the sort of metaphor comes full circle, and you realize that the ecology of human existence and society is very similar to the ecology of, and certainly I am not the first person to make this sort of observation. I just want people to understand that I'm not the first person to think of this, clearly. But, the ecology of the social life is similar to the ecology of life, of nature. And you can find a lot of sort of metaphorical truisms and axioms to accommodate that. And I think that's a really cool and sort of beautifully poetic thing. And that's really all I wanted to say, to be honest. And this is the part where people sense that I'm going to turn the video off soon. As above, so below. Yeah, exactly. And, this is the part where people frantically ask me questions about pest and disease problems before I jump off of live. But if you want to reference this video again, very cool topic, I thought. And I really liked the conversation that it sparked, and the positive feedback from people when I make these sorts of heady topics of conversation. It's not necessarily the most capitalizing content that I make, but it's the kind that I really like to talk about, and I'm glad that other people like it as well. So I like to make it as well because it motivates me to continue on and keep going, especially when I see the really cool questions and statements that people make. You're very welcome, Cannabis. There you go. And you can find this video on Zenthanol, Zenthanol. You can find the link in my bio. If you want to support me, you can support me on Patreon, where I have, for those who aren't aware, I'm not just asking for free money. There are benefits and rewards to people who support at different tiers and different levels. And also I have a PayPal account if you just want to tip me subsidize some of the information that I'm giving out, or some of the advice that I help people with, on Instagram and through other ways as well. I know that many people have appreciated having that ability, and I definitely appreciate people appreciating me. It's kind of a circular thing. You're very welcome, Cold Water Concoctions. I'm glad that people really appreciate the sort of content that I make, because ultimately it's for people to make sure that people sort of have best practices and don't poison themselves and the environment. It'd be nice if that is what happened. So, big ups, global noise, and I'll talk to you all later.